So here we are for the philosophical interview to Professor David Chalmers, who is here in Bologna visiting the Cogito Center. This interview is meant to be published online for the website of AFEX, which is a philosophical Italian website. So first of all, thank you very much, Professor, for accepting this interview. And so the idea is to go through a list of questions that we have prepared, but we can also change in case we see that there is something interesting to say or to ask. So first question, the whole questions are about your latest book, Constructing the World, published last year by Oxford University Press. So this project, the project of Constructing the World, is an ambitious project. And could you explain its basics and what philosophical motivation led you to engage in this project?
Well, Constructing the World is very much inspired by certain projects of Rudolf Carnap, his book. The logische Aufbau der Welt, the logical construction of the world, or sometimes the logical structure of the world, was published in 1928. And it was a project of constructing descriptions of the world, at least, from a very small vocabulary of basic concepts, ultimately logic alone for Carnap. And it's thought that he could ultimately define every expression that we use in a language, construct every concept from a very small set of concepts. Actually, he originally wanted to call the book The Logical Construction of Concepts, but his colleague Otto Neurath said it would sound so much more exciting if he called it The Logical Construction of the World. So he went with that. And I followed Carnap's lead in that regard, although it can't really be said that I'm engaged in creation of the world or engineering or even a metaphysical project. The motivations for the project, it grows very much out of some elements in my earlier work. My first book on consciousness, where I was concerned with the relationship of consciousness to the physical world. I argued that truths about consciousness were not derivable from physical truths, in that you could know all the physical truths, you couldn't derive all the physical truths. There's no a priori entailment from the physical truths to the truths about consciousness. In the current vocabulary, the vocabulary of the current book, that's to say the truths about consciousness are not scrutable from physical truths. Where to be scrutable is roughly that you can somehow, if you know this set of truths, you can know this set of truths. And that got me very interested in this relation of scrutability, which is at the heart of the book. And in that book, I was concerned with its connections to metaphysical questions like the mind-body problem. Then some later work in the philosophy of language, I started developing a kind of what I call epistemological two-dimensional semantics, a broadly Fregean project that uses Carnap-style intentions to find over scenarios, a kind of epistemically possible world, to serve as meanings that can play something of the role of Fregean senses. And it's been a somewhat controversial project, and part of the controversy is whether these intentions are well-defined and can play the roles I want them to play. And I came to the view that really the key issue underlying all this is this relation of scrutability, and a certain thesis that these truths are scrutable from certain more basic truths in a basic vocabulary. Given the scrutability thesis, two-dimensional semantics of this kind can work. If not, then it doesn't. So I thought, actually, I need to really work on articulating and defending this thesis. For a while, it was going to be a chapter or two in another book on meaning, but it took on a life of its own. And then I saw all these connections to Carnap's project started building up, a Carnap's project in the Aufbau, and that really kind of gave the project a kind of a special life and a special focus that ended up turning the book into the somewhat Carnap-oriented book that it is today.
Explicitly link your project to Rudolf Carnap and his logical construction of the world. And in that book, Carnap tries to reduce all truth by means of definition to logical and phenomenal truth. However, Carnap's project has been targeted by important objections by an impressive series of philosophers. Goodman, Quine, Chisholm, Newman, Weissman, Wittgenstein, and Crick. These objections deal with Carnap's specification of the phenomenal vocabulary and his definitional method of reduction. He later took distance from his original project. What do you think is the philosophical legacy of this Carnapian project? And why do you still think it is an interesting one?
Yeah, I found that in my own philosophical work, I keep rediscovering or reinventing or reheating Carnap's ideas left and right. From many different stages, two-dimensional semantics is a reheating of the Carnap of meaning and necessity, be inspired by his metaphysical views, but very much here by the Aufbau, the logical construction of the world, in part because this really is all about deriving all truths about the world from a very, very limited class of truths, truth in a very limited vocabulary. Now for Carnap, his vocabulary was very limited indeed. Officially, he wants just logical expressions alone. So there exist certain objects, maybe there exist certain properties, and there exist certain relations. So the objects have these relevant properties and these relations in a certain pattern. For much of the book, he actually he has one other primitive expression. The relation he calls R for phenomenal similarity. And he defines everything about the world in terms of phenomenal similarity. Qualia defined in terms of circles of phenomenal similarity. Space-time is defined in terms of qualia. Behavior of other people is defined in terms of spatiotemporal properties. Other minds are defined in terms of behavior, culture, and values in terms of other minds, and on you go. Now, this project has received many criticisms, as you say. One class of the criticisms are tied to the particular base that Carnap chooses. I mean, for much of the Aufbau, he has the phenomenal base, then he tries to actually pare it down to a purely logical base. Goodman argued that Carnap's phenomenal construction of qualia from phenomenal similarity can't work. Quine argued his construction of space-time from qualia can't work. And many other people, going back to the mathematician Max Newman, and even Carnap himself, have noted problems with having logic alone in the base. It tends to trivialize the project. Part of my thought is that where that problem is concerned, that's not the central problem for any Aufbau-style project. It's a problem for Carnap's specific choice of expressions to use in the base. So if the project was defined as being logic-based project, then the objection might be fatal. If it was defined as being a phenomenalist project, just phenomenal things in the base, maybe some of these objections would be potentially fatal. But I don't think one should understand these constructive projects as allied to those theses. My thought is, why not expand the base? Why not take a bit more in the base? For example, one could add notions like causation, space, time to the base, and then one would avoid these problems, these famous problems for the Carnap project. The other style of famous problems for the Carnap style project is that he relies on definitions, defining every expression in terms of some underlying key terms. And many philosophers and others have grown very skeptical of the project of definition. People think that, it's very hard to find a good definition of anything in philosophy. The moment you try, someone will come up with a counterexample. So maybe someone defines knowledge as justified true belief. It turns out, Gettier found a counterexample, justified true belief without knowledge. We refine our definition. Justified true belief not inferred from a false belief. Someone else comes up with a counterexample, involving fake bars. And someone comes up with a 12-clause definition of knowledge, maybe Chisholm. Someone else comes up with a counterexample. No end in sight. So people have grown very skeptical of the definitional project. So that's what motivates for me the idea that, okay, we should give up on the definitional relation or not use definition as a central constructive notion. For it's not all truths are definable in terms of the truths in the base, but look for a weaker relation. And the relation I choose is what I call scrutability. All truths are scrutable from truth in the base. And this takes many different forms, but the rough idea is that, once you knew all the truths in the base, you could know all the truths. And here the inspiration is actually not Carnap, but Laplace's demon. Laplace said if you knew the positions of all the entities at a given time and fundamental laws of nature, and you had a vast enough intellect to submit all this to analysis, you'd be uncertain of nothing. in effect, you'd know everything. That's a scrutability thesis. With knowledge of all the fundamental entities and fundamental laws, you can deduce all truth from there. It doesn't require definition, it's an epistemological thesis, and it's roughly that epistemological project that I've pursued. So to sum up, the thought is that, yes, there are these famous problems for Carnap tied to the base and tied to the definition of relation, but we can get around those by expanding the base and by weakening the relation. And that's the project of my book.
Go back to your book. In your favorite version of the base, you include phenomenal qualia, I mean phenomenal truth, and that suggests that the conscious is not reducible to the physical. And this is a topic in which you wrote at length in your past. And could you say something on that?
Yeah, it's interesting, and this does have a certain relation to Carnap himself. In the Aufbau, Carnap uses a phenomenal basis and tries to construct the physical world from there. He suggests that he might have used a physical basis and then somehow construct the phenomenal world from there. I think these days people are fairly skeptical of both projects, whether you can deduce all the physical truths from phenomenal truths. There are worries here about, the external world seems to have a reality that goes beyond the phenomenal, and there are hypotheses about the external world you can't get from the phenomenal truths. But in the reverse direction, there are famous reasons for doubting you can get phenomenal truths about consciousness, from physical truths. One such example is Frank Jackson's thought experiment of Mary in the black and white room. She knows all the physical truths about the world, but she's grown up in a black and white room and she's never seen the color red. There's some crucial phenomenal truth she doesn't know about what it's like to see red. I would use this to suggest that phenomenal truths are not in fact scrutable from physical truths. And I think this point is fairly widely accepted. I go on from there to argue for dualism, that the metaphysical thesis of physicalism is false. Some people will go on to reject that stuff. But interestingly, there was an earlier stage of Carnap in a paper of his from 1923 called On the Task of Physics, where he says, look, for Laplace's demon to do its job adequately, it would need 3 volumes of facts. Yes, it would need all the physical facts, but he says it would also need the sensory facts. The facts about sensory stuff, like redness and sliminess, and the sound of music, and so on. And it's very easy to... And actually, he says you would need a 3rd volume too, a volume of laws connecting the physical domain with the sensory domain. And it's hard to know exactly what's going on with Carnap there, but it's very easy to read him as being motivated by these concerns. You can't get the phenomenal from the physical, and you also can't get the physical from the phenomenal. So let's start with both those volumes of facts. And that's the approach that I end up taking in my book, at least for much of the book. Instead of starting with just a physical base or just a phenomenal base, which would give rise to these problems, let's start with a base that has both the physics, the physical, and the phenomenal. I mean, this does actually correspond to what I think is something like the right metaphysical base for understanding the world. I'm a dualist who thinks there are fundamental physical and fundamental phenomenal properties. It's a kind of property dualism. But I think of this also just as a fairly neutral starting point for the project. If someone later on thinks we can get rid of the phenomenal, well, first I'll suggest that I'll start with this very generous scrutability base, PQTI. Physics, qualia, the phenomenal, that's all truth. I think that's all there is in the world. And indexical truths about where I am and what time it is now, unless there's worries about whether those are scrutable. Start with this very generous base, PQTI, and then argue that all truth is scrutable from there, and then later on see about minimizing it. I don't think I'm begging any questions against the physicalist by starting with PQTI. The physicalist could agree that all truth is scrutable from PQTI, just they'll think that ultimately we can get rid of Q. Some physicalists, the likes of David Lewis at least, and the current version of Frank Jackson, will think that all phenomenal truths are in fact scrutable from physical truths. If so, they can later on get rid of it. Other physicalists will agree with me that Q needs to be in the scrutability base while still denying that it's metaphysically fundamental. And they'll just do that by separating the epistemological relation of scrutability from metaphysical relations like supervenience and grounding. So I think both those reactions are available. But I think it makes it a reasonably neutral starting ground to start with a generous scrutability base like PQTI.